What's up guys, Asian here with our tank gear video for the Greymoor patch. Now for tanks, not much has actually changed between Harrowstorm and Greymoor. There was a few sets introduced in Greymoor. Obviously we have Overland sets, crafted sets, and the new trial sets, but none of them really are worth running as a tank. So in terms of your gear and overall how you build your tank, not much is going to be changing. So whatever build you are running for Harrowstorm is most likely going to work without any sort of adjustments in Greymoor as well. Obviously this is going to depend on your group composition and your specific class, but for the most part your build in Harrowstorm will transition very easily over to Greymoor. In this video, we will just be going over gear and any sort of class agnostic sort of settings, so things like your race, your attribute points, your mundus stone, the food, etc. For more class specific builds, you will need to go to specific class builds, which I will have linked in the description below. Some of them are not out right now. The description will be updated as I upload those tank builds. So let's go ahead and get started here. So this is just one of many different setups that you could run as a tank. I will be going over all different tanking sets you're going to want to have on hand, both sort of what you should have and what are nice to have sets as well. So again, this is just one possible gear combination you're going to be running as a tank. There are obviously many more out there depending on your group composition and what your raid lead specifically needs. The Mars Helm set, though, Symphony of Blades, is still going to be a very nice Mars Helm set to run. It was changed from Harrowstorm to Greymoor, so it now affects multiple people, but as a result of that, it also restores less magicka and stamina back. So this is mostly going to be relegated to the tank. So if you are wearing Symphony of Blades, just make sure you have an ability on your bar that heals other people. The most basic way of getting this would be using something like Echoing Vigor, but some classes do have class abilities that they can use to heal other people, like for example, Ash Cloud for DKs. Next, we have Yolnahkriin. This is one of the only ways to get Minor Courage. The only other way to get Minor Courage is through a werewolf tank, but obviously we are not going to be seeing many werewolf tanks in trial, so Yolnahkriin is going to be the go-to to obtain this very important buff here. This is a heavy armor set from Sunspire, so you can wear this wherever you really like, whether that be on your weapons or on your body. Next we have Alkosh. This is still going to be the most important, or one of the most important debuff sets you could run as a tank. It reduces physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by 3010 for 10 seconds, as long as you activate a synergy. So this comes from Maw of Lorkhaj, which you will need access to the Thieves Guild DLC in order to obtain here. Still going to be most likely going to be on a tank. There are very few scenarios where you will not be running this. It will be easier to run this on a stamina DPS, but those situations are far and few between. There's probably only a handful of fights where you'll see that being the case, so just make sure to have Alkosh here. Typically speaking, both tanks will be running Alkosh, but sometimes only one tank will be running it. Really depends on the fight. Before we go on to other sets, I do want to point out your traits and enchants for your armor traits and weapons. So for our front bar, we have the sword and shield, as we always have. As I mentioned in all my previous tanking videos, your enchant and trait here on your sword doesn't really matter too much. I typically go with decisive just for the small chance of initial ultimate, which will help out our Warhorn uptime. It basically gets a little bit faster Warhorn. And enchant you can really place wherever you want here. One-handed enchants are pretty weak, so it doesn't really matter what you put here on your front bar. I have a weakening enchant, but you can go with something like Absorb Stamina if you want the additional stamina sustain, Absorb Health, Hardening. It's really up to you. The only enchant you want to avoid is going to be the Crusher enchant. Then for your shields, we have Sturdy with a Prismatic enchant. And then for your back bar, we are running the Lightning Staff. You could also run the Ice Staff, which will give you a little bit more block mitigation if you do happen to get caught on your back bar. Just make sure to avoid the Tri-Focus passive, because you will be using your magicka to block if you take that passive. Lightning Staff will help with off-balance uptime, because you will be using block A to help proc that enchant there on your back bar. You can also run the bow back bar if you want to do a little bit more DPS. That's typically just because tanks run higher stamina and weapon damage compared to max magicka and spell damage, so you're getting a little bit more DPS out of Endless Hail than you would with block aid. Regardless of whichever weapon you decide to choose, make sure it's infused. Crusher enchant is typically what you're going to be running here, but you could also use any other sort of enchant, like for example weakening, if somebody else is going to be responsible for the Crusher enchant. For jewelry, your enchant, you can go with reduce block cost is going to be probably the safest route to go. There is also just reduce cost abilities, reduce cost enchants, which are new in Greymoor. I don't have one on screen right now to share with you guys, but that is one potential option too. Reduce potion cooldown glyphs are also an option, particularly if you're an Argonian, because of the Argonian racial passive. But reducing block of cost of block is probably going to be one of the safer enchants to go for. In terms of traits, I like to go with Triune, but there are other traits you can run infused for stronger jewelry enchants. You can go Harmony if you want a little bit more resources out of your orbs and shards. You can go Swift if you want a little bit more movement speed, which is always really nice to have, especially in certain trials. But Triune is going to be the safest way, safest enchant to run. You could also run things like just Robust or Healthy, depending on which stat you feel like you need the most of. For armor traits and enchants, typically speaking, you will have prismatics on all of your pieces, but if you don't want to spend the gold to create out prismatics on everything, you can run something like health, stamina, or magic enchants instead on your small pieces. Typically speaking, though, you do want to have prismatics on your large pieces, just because you get the full enchant effect here. Small pieces, not that big of a deal. In terms of traits, you have a few options here. I like to go with infused on all of my large pieces. That is the helm, chest, and legs, just for a little bit of additional resources. You could still go with sturdy to decrease the cost of block. Your small pieces will always be sturdy. There's pretty much no real other good trait to run as a tank. You could, for example, run divines if you want a little bit more out of your mundus stone, but typically speaking, reducing the cost of block is going to be more important. So sturdy on all of your small pieces, and then on your large pieces, you can choose between infused or sturdy depending on which trait you prefer to have. It really is dependent on your personal tanking style, your own sustain, things like that. Now, as to other sets, first let's go ahead and talk about other Mosh Helm sets that you could run. There are a few Mosh Helm sets here to run as a tank. The first one here is going to be Selma Rufugams, which pretty much fits the same role as Symphony of Blades. This is just a base game set. So this is Darkshade Caverns versus Symphony of Blades, which is Depth of Malatar. Just still returns magic and stamina back. It does require a heal. It is returning less magic and stamina per tick, but that's just sort of what you kind of have to deal with here. Next, we have Swarm Mother, which is good for tanks that don't want to run Silver Leash or don't have a class pulling ability. Swarm Mother can be very useful here just to help pull things closer to you. It can be a little bit inconsistent to use though, so I would still recommend running Silver Leash or whatever your class chains is, but this is an option if you don't want to run those abilities. Next, we have Tremorscale, which is going to be pretty much mandatory in any sort of group that has running majority stamina DPS. This reduces physical resistance by 2395 for any enemy that you taunt for 8 seconds. So very important to run for stamina DPS because it is a unique debuff, so it does stack with all other existing physical resistance debuffs in the game. This allows stamina DPS to run fewer points into piercing, and that gives turn increases their overall DPS because they can shift those CPU points into other nodes. So very important Mosh Helm set to pick up here for stamina DPS groups. This comes from Volenfell, so this is a base game set. Storm Mother is also a base game set, which comes from Spindle Clutch 1. Moving on, Earthgore has some niche uses. This is a little bit less bursty than it has been in the past. So it restores 35,211 health over 10 seconds. So you're getting about 3.5k per tick. And this can occur every 20 seconds. So a little bit less bursty than it has been in the past, but still useful in those situations where you need the additional burst heal. Whether that be for progression stuff or because you're in a situation where you're not going to have easy access to a healer, for example, downstairs the portal group in Cloud Rest. Moving on from there, Lord Warden for the additional resistances. This is still going to be useful. They did nerf it a little bit here, but it's still going to be beneficial to get a little bit of additional survivability out. This does come from Imperial City Prison, so this is a DLC set, I believe. Bloodspawn was also nerfed fairly heavily, so you now only generate 8 ultimate instead of 14 as you did in Herostorm, but it's still worth potentially picking up. It's just less of an important set here. Personally, I probably wouldn't spend time farming for Bloodspawn if you don't have it already. This comes from Spindle Clutch too, so this is a base game set for you guys to farm. Thurvokun is another possibly good set, although it did end up getting a bit of a nerf here because you can't get 100% uptime on it. This is just an easy way to get AoE Minor Maim and Minor Defile out. Minor Defile doesn't really matter too much for PvE, but the Minor Maim is also pretty important, especially for classes that don't have access to an AoE Minor Maim ability. It just helps out your overall survivability. Really great in trash fights. I found it to be very useful in places like Black Rose Prison, where you have a lot of adds that can be potentially dangerous for your allies. And then we have Vykosa, which is another debuff set here, which comes from Moonhunter Keep, so another DLC set. This just lowers weapon and spell damage by 20% for anything you bash if you have it taunted for 5 seconds. So it just helps decrease incoming damage, which helps out overall survivability. And then finally we have Stonekeeper, which is a selfish set here. So this comes from Frostvault, which is a DLC dungeon. Whenever you block an attack, you gain an energy charge stack, and once you gain 6 charges, you restore 2480 stamina, magicka, and base health. That is obviously affected by your CPs and other sort of buffs. But once you release a charge, you can't regain new ones for 20 seconds. So this has been slightly nerfed, but it's still fairly decent as a selfish sustain set here, especially because you can get 4 charges in a second if you happen to block 4 attacks in that 1 second. So pretty useful for selfish scenarios. And that pretty much covers all the different Monster Helm sets. Now, in terms of Overland sets, you do have a couple of Overland sets here that I do want to cover. Starting off with heavy Overland sets, the first one I want to talk about is going to be Plague Doctor. This is your traditional, very selfish tanking build, which just adds a bunch of max health. Could be useful for progression style groups, but you generally speaking will want to transition out of using Plague Doctor because it doesn't really provide anything for the group. General idea of playing a tank in ESO is to help provide group utility, and Plague Doctor does not provide that. So while it's good for learning content, you're going to want to transition out of it as soon as you can, just because you're not really doing your group any favors by running Plague Doctor. Moving on, we have Alkosh Dragon Guard, which reduces the cost of your ultimate abilities by 15%, which allows you to get faster war horns, which improves major force uptime, directly increasing overall group DPS. This is a base game set from Eastmarch. Let's see, Plague Doctor is also a base game set from Deshawn. But moving on from there, Livewire could be nice to apply AoE concussion. This comes from Clockwork City. It's fairly situational, Livewire here. But that is pretty much it for Overland sets in terms of the heavy Overland sets. Nothing much under medium and light. There is one medium Overland set I do want to mention. Trying to find it here. Are you Hide of the Werewolf? This one here, whenever you take damage, you generate 5 ultimate once every 5 seconds. So much like it Alkosh Dragon Guard, it just basically gets you faster Warhorn uptimes. Now this is a medium armor set, so you will need to run jewelry and weapons if you are running this set. And then for light Overland sets, there really aren't any to run. So next, moving on to dungeon sets, there are quite a few dungeon sets you're going to want to have on hand. Under the heavy armor sets, make sure to pick up Ebon Armory. This is a base game tank set from Crypt of Hearts, which increases max health across the board for everybody within your group. This just gives your DPS a little bit more survivability. You don't have to worry as much about their health, which allows them to concentrate more on just doing raw damage. They don't have to necessarily sacrifice anything to increase their max health. Some of the very, very high-end groups don't run Ebon Armory, but that's just because they know how to avoid damage. For most groups, I would recommend running Ebon Armory on one of your tanks here. From there, though, Leeching can be situationally useful. It does have a spot, especially when you're trying to progress stuff, but much like Plague Doctor, it's a very selfish set, so I would highly recommend not running Leeching Plate unless you absolutely need to, because it doesn't provide any sort of group utility. It's a very, very selfish set, and generally speaking, you want to avoid selfish sets as a tank. Same thing with Jail's Tenacity. It is useful in a few scenarios where you want additional major vitality, like Cloud Rest, for example. But again, it's a selfish-oriented set, so you're going to want to shift away from it as soon as you can. But it's still a good set for progression. And then we have Dragon's Defilement, which when you take damage from a melee attack, you gain an aura that applies Minor Fracture, Minor Breach to enemies around you. This is useful for trash fights, especially in places with a lot of adds, because now the Templar doesn't have to use Powerful Eye on every single add. You just have an AoE, Minor Fracture, Minor Breach, but it does require you to take damage from melee attacks, so just keep that in mind. It will not proc off of things like bow attacks or staff attacks. It needs to be a direct melee attack. This one is a DLC dungeon set from Lair Marcelock, so you will need to have access to that dungeon to grab this set. Now, in terms of medium and light armor sets from dungeons, there are a few. Oops, Overland dungeon. First, with medium dungeon sets, the one I want to talk about is going to be Hircine's Veneer. This is important for stamina DPS groups. Reduces the cost of stamina abilities by 4%. So, much like Hide of the Werewolf, this is a medium armor set, so you're going to want to run jewelry and a weapon, so you will need to transmute, potentially, your jewelry, depending on if you want robust or not. And then finally, for your light dungeon set, you do want to pick up the Magicka version of Hircine's Veneer, which is, if I can find it here, a Worm's Raiment. So this comes from Vault of Madness, so this is a base game set. Reduces the cost of magic abilities by 4%. So for magic heavy groups, you are going to want to have this set on hand. Again, much like the medium armor sets, you will want to run jewelry and weapons with Worm's Raiment. Finally, for trial sets, we've pretty much covered the two most important trial sets to pick up, but there is one heavy trial set that you might want to consider picking up here, and that's going to be Aegis of Gallenway from Cloudrest. This now grants empower to up to 11 allies within 15 meters of you, but it does occur once every 2 seconds. You're not going to get really good uptime on Empower. I believe they've tested it out on the PTS, and they were getting about 30% uptime on the Empower, so not very high uptime, but it is still something, so it is still a potential set to run if you don't really have any other set to use here, but it's not something I would necessarily go out of my way to farm for. So this does come from Cloudrest. Perfect version does come from completing Cloudrest Vet. Armor from +1, jewelry from +2, weapons from any of the vet configurations. You don't have to necessarily get the perfect version, it just adds additional max health. You could just run the non-perfect version, which you can get just from running Cloudrest on normal. And that pretty much covers it for all of the trial sets. There's not really much under medium or light you want to pick up as a tank. Moving on to our character sheets, the best race to run is arguably going to be Nord. Nords get both health and stamina, and they get some additional ultimate generation whenever they take damage. So pretty solid stats around the board for Nords. If you have access to the Imperial race, Imperials are also a pretty good race as well. They get max health, max stamina, and they get some sustain and cost reduction to all abilities. Argonians aren't bad either. They don't get any additional max stamina. They do get a little bit of health and a little bit of magicka, so you might need to play around with attribute points to make sure your stamina is higher than your magicka. But the big advantage of running Argonians is you do get the potion passive, which grants you some additional magic health and stamina back whenever you drink a potion. So if you're using tri-stat potions, this combined with the Argonian potion passive, restoring some additional resources, basically means you essentially restore up to 50 to 60% of your magic and stamina pool in a single tri-potion, which is very helpful. But Argonians in general are generally regarded as a weaker tank compared to Nords and Imperials. If you also want to do some off DPS on the side, Orcs are also pretty decent. They get a little bit of health and max stamina as well. They get some movement speed, which can be beneficial. You will see a little bit of a difference with higher movement speed. They do get the additional weapon damage though, 258 additional weapon damage. So if you do want to off DPS as a tank, or if you want to run as a stamina DPS as a tank, you could go with Orcs. Finally, my personal favorite is going to be Dark Elves. They get both max stamina and max magicka, so you don't get any additional max health, which could be an issue, so you might need to stat a little bit more heavily into health as a Dark Elf tank, but you do get the flexibility of having higher magicka and stamina pools compared to like in Nord, for example. Plus you also get additional 258 spell damage and weapon damage, so if you do decide to go for a healer or a DPS build, you're more easily able to do that as a Dark Elf compared to, like, for example, a Nord, where you're really limited to just maybe a stamina DPS, and even then you're going to be subpar compared to something like an Orc stamina DPS. In terms of attribute points, this is going to be very dependent on your race. Obviously, Nords get both health and stamina, but if you're playing like a Dark Elf, for example, you might need to spec a little bit more heavily into health because you don't have any additional health passives from your racial bonuses. The flip side of that though is like if you are a Dark Elf, you might not need to put as many points into Magic and Stamina because you're getting some points, some additional resources there from your Rage of Passage as well. Generally speaking, what you're going to want to go for is going to be 35k max health. That's sort of the bare minimum that I recommend, and then bump up your Magic and Stamina from there. Most important thing to make note of is to make sure your stamina is higher than your magicka, because orbs and shards will return your highest pool out of these two pools. You're going to want to make sure to return stamina because that is your primary blocking resource. So again, try to hit 35k max health is the bare minimum you should be hitting, and then try to hit magicka and stamina as much as you can within that 35k max health range here. For food, we are running Bewitched Sugar Skulls here. This is a gold food, which is fairly cheap to obtain. This increases max health, max stamina, and max magicka. It also gives us health regen. This is stronger than the base game purple food by a little bit here, but you can use base game purple food if you don't have access to the Bewitched Sugar Skulls. Now for Mundus Stone, you have a few options here. My personal favorite is going to be the Atronach because it gives you additional magicka regen. So that just gives you a little bit more magicka back every 2 seconds to help buff things up. So things like running things like Igneous Shields, for example, that just gets you a little bit more magicka back for your self-heals. For example, use a lot of magicka. A lot of your buffing skills in general does use magicka, so having a little bit of magicka regen is always nice. If you want some additional health, you can go with the Lord. The Lord gives you max health. If you want some additional resistances, you can go with the Lady, for example. If you are also DPSing, you might want to go with the Shadow or the Thief. So you do have quite a few options here when it comes to your Mundus Stone. But my personal favorite is the Atronach with additional magicka regen. Now for champion points, so this might vary a little bit depending on what you need out of your tank. But for your green CP, 64 into Arcanist and 49 Tenacity is generally speaking the two most important things here, followed by Shadow Ward. I like to have at least 61 points in your Shadow Ward. You can bump this up to 66 if you'd like for the next jump point, but at the very least 61 is what I recommend as a bare minimum with the Shadow Ward to help reduce the cost of block. From there, your points can go wherever you'd like, so 44 Tumbling, for example. Then I have 44 Warlord and 8 into Bashing Focus, so it's kind of up to you where you want to put those remaining points here. The most important is going to be Shadow Ward here, 61 at the very least. You can drop Arcanist down a little bit if you'd like, 56 or 49. Tenacity 49 is a pretty nice sort of middle point here for you just to get a little bit more stamina back with your heavy attacks. For blue CPs, you have a couple of options here. This is sort of a full tank option, but you can use just straight up stamina and DPS CP. If you want to have more information on that, check out my stamina gear video, which will cover CP there. But for just a pure tanking, you want 75 into Bless, 66 into Elfborn, 66 into Precise Strikes. That just helps out your critical healing with stamina and heat and magicka abilities. The rest you can put wherever. Blue CPs are more focused on DPS, so we have 32 Mighty and 31 Piercing. Doesn't really matter where you put your blue CPs. For red CPs, you might need to shift some points around depending on how you want to maximize your mitigation, depending on your trial, for example. I have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thickskin, 64 Hardy, and 64 Elemental Defender. This is going to be the most balanced approach and will give you very good mitigation across all pieces of content that you might be tanking in the game. But that pretty much covers it for this video. Down in the description below, you will find links to all of the class tanking videos as they come out. Along with that, you will also find the CP distribution that I recommend that you run, as well as a description of all of the sets that I covered, including where to find them and under which situation you're going to want to run them in and why they're useful. So all that stuff is going to be in the description below, as well as eventually a link to the ESOU Discord where there will be a written guide for this video. Well, that's it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions, feel free to them down in the comment section below, and I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.